The Algerian Revolution was one of the most significant anti-colonial uprisings of the 20th century. It resulted in the deaths of around 400,000 Algerians, although some estimates put the number closer to the 1 million casualty range. The revolution prompted the mobilization of 2 million French soldiers and featured horrific atrocities committed by France, with the torture of hundreds of thousands of Algerians. The violence and bloodshed seen during the Algerian Revolution was the culmination of a 132-year-long brutal colonial conquest. Algeria was a colony directly ruled from the metropole, with the Algerian departments having the same administrative status as those in the metropole. However, France imposed a regime in which structural inequality was enforced through land expropriation, the indigénat, and repressive violence. In 1954, Algerian revolutionaries started a campaign of guerrilla warfare, diplomatic pressure, and mass mobilization to overthrow French rule in Algeria. This video will try to understand the Algerian Revolution from two different perspectives. Firstly, Theda Skocpol's theory on social revolutions will be examined. This section will analyze the structural elements that caused the Algerian Revolution. Essentially, it will analyze why the revolution was an inevitable consequence of the nature of French rule in Algeria. Secondly, Keith Michael Baker and Dan Edelstein's theory on revolutionary scripts will be examined. This section will analyze and focus on the strategies employed by Algerian revolutionaries and which revolutionary precedents they used as references, guides, and frameworks of action. This theory focuses more on the self-aware nature of revolutionaries, which is very fitting to the Algerian case, in which the Evelyn devised a carefully thought-of strategy for independence. Skocpol defines social revolutions as rapid basic transformations of a society's state and class structure, and they are accompanied and in part carried through by class-based revolts from below. They are transformative processes that combine societal, class, and political change. This section will analyze Skocpol's theory of revolution using Algeria in the following ways. Firstly, Skocpol argues that revolutions are caused by structural changes to the state and society. She pays special attention to these structural factors affecting state breakdown. For Skocpol, the state is not simply an arena for political actors or societal conflicts to emerge, but an autonomous actor with its own interests. Social revolutions cause the collapse of the old state structure and the emergence of a new state structure. Skocpol considers the old state's internal contradictions to be a vital point of analysis. This section will analyze the internal weaknesses and contradictions of French Algeria. Secondly, Skocpol argues that an international system of competing states serves as a powerful structural force. Skocpol claims that modern social revolutions have occurred only in states situated in disadvantageous positions within international arenas. Specifically, international competition between states can give revolutions the necessary breathing room for success. This section will examine how the international context of the Cold War greatly helped the Algerian Revolution succeed. Finally, Skocpol considers the role of the peasantry to be very important for social revolutions, especially anti-colonial ones. Peasants are a central part of the revolutionary struggle. This is because peasant revolts came with and accelerated the breakdown of old state structures. They are especially powerful in agrarian countries and strike against the upper landowning classes. This section will analyze the impact of the peasantry during the Algerian Revolution. As mentioned, Skocpol places a heightened importance on the emergence of internal contradictions within the state and how this enables revolution and state breakdown. Skocpol considers directly ruled colonial regimes, especially settler-dominated ones such as Algeria, to be vulnerable and rigid. This vulnerability is for two major reasons. Firstly, she claims directly ruled colonies tend to be quite repressive and unreformable. The repressiveness radicalizes the moderate sections of the colonized people. Secondly, in these types of colonial regimes, the forces of class struggle and oppression often get subsumed into the forces of national liberation. In this section, 3 aspects of the Algerian colonial state's breakdown and weakness will be analyzed. Firstly, this section will analyze the rigidity and unreformability of French Algeria. Secondly, the relationship between class and national struggle will be analyzed in the Algerian Revolution, concluding that these two came hand in hand. Finally, this section will analyze the transition and collapse of the old colonial French regime towards the National Liberation Front's new regime. Skocpol considers directly ruled colonies such as Algeria to be unreformable and rigid. This terminology can easily be applied to French Algeria, due in part to the presence of a powerful, institutionally privileged settler population. Reforms that could satisfy moderate Algerian activists were often shot down. A notable example would be the failure of the 1935 Popular Front to enact any reforms in Algeria. The Popular Front's plans to enact a moderate proposal extending voting rights to 25,000 Muslims in Algeria, also called the Blum-Violet Bill, were blocked by the colonial lobby. Settlers in Algeria presented a continuous thorn in the path of any reforms that could potentially satisfy moderate Algerian activists. The governor and architect of the reform, Maurice Violet, was so hated by settlers that he was called Violet l'Arbi, or Violet the Arab. As we can see, the direct control of Algeria, especially the settler element, contributed to a lack of reform and rigidity, which in turn radicalized Algerians in favor of a violent struggle for independence. Natalya Vince writes that the failure of the Blum-Violet Bill was not random but evidence of the structural contradictions of Algeria and the tension between liberal humanist rhetoric that promised change and a continuity of authoritarian practices. James McDougall also summarized the settler mindset. The settlers saw their security of livelihood, home, and person as dependent on the continued subjugation of the Algerians, the native peril, whom they saw through a confused combination of racial and religious stereotypes, exotic fantasies, imagined paternal benevolence, and, from time to time, hysterical terror. The failures of minor reform bills such as the Blum-Violet Bill indicated to many Algerians that French Algeria would not be able to reform itself. In addition, French Algeria in its later years transitioned into a heavily repressive police state. The transition occurred after the Sétif and Guelma massacres in 1945. These events started off as clashes between Algerian demonstrators bearing nationalist symbols and colonial state police, but turned into a months-long military campaign in which many thousands of Algerians were killed. Martin Thomas argues that the 1945 uprising did at least precipitate a revolution in security practice and consequent legal restrictions, which effectively made colonial Algeria a police state. The French state stopped distinguishing nuances between various Algerian activist groups. They all started being considered a threat to the state and would face massive repression. Whether a group was assimilationist or advocating for independence, whether they were peaceful or violent, all of them would be treated with violence and repression by the French state. This new and even more repressive colonial system was ideal for settlers. Martin Evan writes, "In this climate of muscular imperialism, the settlers felt protected. Backed up by the provisional government, they felt that May 1945 had restored them to a position of supreme strength." Essentially, the French Algerian state was repressive and unreformable, and created the conditions for many Algerians, moderate and radical, to participate in and start the revolution against France. Skocpol mentions that directly ruled colonies such as Algeria also create unity between economic and nationally oriented demands. The French colonial system was designed to deliberately upturn the social order with the goal of weakening the Algerian population. Mahmoud Benoun describes the various stages of French colonization, in which subjugation came hand in hand with land theft. French settlers were assigned vast swaths of fertile land, while Algerian peasants were left with minimal and unproductive land. As the Algerian population expanded, France realized that Algerians could be a source of cheap labor to work as sharecroppers and laborers on European estates. Benoun concludes and corroborates Skocpol's thesis that the colonial system made Algerian society split between a colonial bourgeoisie and a resourceless, disinherited proletariat. This colonial bourgeoisie was built into the French colonial system. It was a part of a system which ensured European settler domination. James McDougall writes that these settlers saw their own place within the free and equal republic of citizens as viable only by the complete subordination of Algerian territory and its resources, including, crucially, its inhabitants' cheaply exploitable labor, to their economic and political control. The colonial system is therefore clearly conducive to subsuming class demands within national liberation demands. Land theft came hand in hand with repression at the hands of the police and army. Economic disenfranchisement was integral to the colonial system, and therefore economic demands and anger were easily integrated into the revolutionary struggle against France. Skocpol also emphasizes the effectiveness of revolutionaries providing state-like collective goods to their constituents. In this sense, it is crucial to see how Algerian revolutionaries helped establish what Natalya Vince calls a state within a state. During the Algerian War, competition for legitimacy was waged on the international level, but also crucially on the local level. The FLN instructed Algerians to completely reject and boycott the authority of the colonial regime, and the FLN created local councils, which established educational, welfare, and judicial systems. This was created to undermine the authority of the colonial regime, enabling the FLN to legitimately claim to be the state representatives of Algerians. This aspect of the Algerian Revolution fits well into Skocpol's theory of the breakdown of the French state and the transition into the new revolutionary one. As Natalya Vince writes, overall, the vast majority of Algerians were convinced, rather than coerced, into seeing the FLN as the legitimate representative of the people and the state. Overall, we see that state breakdown and the emergence of a new state to take over administrative, judicial, welfare, and policing roles were very present and successful during the Algerian Revolution. As outlined by Skocpol, the international system of states is a crucial element for the success of a revolution. The usage of diplomacy and international competition to create opportunities and breathing room was crucial for Algerian revolutionaries. Matthew Connolly argues that Algerian revolutionaries heavily exploited the Cold War rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. One of the architects of the Algerian Revolution, Hossein Aïd Ahmed, argues that Algerian foreign policy should be flexible and pragmatic, specifically by exploiting America's rivalry with the Soviet Union to undermine the Franco-American alliance. A crucial element that aided the Algerians was the United States' preoccupation with ingratiating itself with Arabic-speaking countries to prevent them from passing into the Soviet sphere of influence. Algerian revolutionaries also used the support of former colonized countries to push the Algerian question to the United Nations, granting the FLN greater international legitimacy. Eventually, the United States would push France to negotiate a settlement to resolve the war. Matthew Connolly summarizes the strategy. By thinking and acting globally to attain their goals at home and abroad, the Algerians revealed how even a stateless and embattled people could be the authors of their own history, a history in which the Cold War was a small but essential part. Overall, the Algerian Revolution demonstrates how exploiting opportunities within an international context provides the breathing room for revolutions to succeed. Finally, Skocpol outlined the importance of the peasantry in revolutions. In the Algerian case, the peasantry played a crucial role during the course of the revolution and presented a continuous challenge to French authorities throughout the war. The radicalization of the Algerian peasantry was caused by settler domination of fertile lands and the relegation of Algerian peasants to arid and mountainous regions. The domination of a land-owning settler upper class was built into the colonial system. Neil MacMaster demonstrates how Algerian peasants had autonomous and highly developed forms of social and political organization, making them useful autonomous sources of resistance against the French state during the revolution. Algerian peasants often organized themselves in units of 400 to 600 people, which regulated affairs through an autonomous assembly called a Gemma. Throughout even the toughest years of French conquest, these small units of Algerian peasant organization continued to exist and provide extensive resistance to French colonialism. Especially in the mountain regions, peasants resisted interactions with French state agents. Neil MacMaster quotes Georges-Henri Bousquet, who describes how little children at 5 years are already indoctrinated, and just like adults maintain secrecy when external authorities come. The assembly meeting showed high degrees of communal support. Here is a description of one of the meetings of a peasant assembly. Each man spoke in turn, and discussion was engaged in a calm, ordered way, ending in operational decisions that concerned firstly their reply to pressing problems, immediate issues of survival, how to counter the measles epidemic, assist deconstruction of a house, ensure the defense of those militants who had been arrested, to support their families who had been left totally without resources, etc. When the revolution commenced, these systems of peasant organization were of great help to the FLN's armed wing, the National Liberation Army, or the ALN. The ALN would often use the peasantry along with its own reserves to replenish food and other vital supplies. The Algerian peasantry was particularly effective at dodging French authorities. To avoid demanding too much from impoverished Algerian peasants, the FLN developed sophisticated tax collection programs in urban zones to use to purchase peasant goods. MacMaster describes the ALN control of mountainous regions during the war. However, during 1956 and 1957, the peak of ALN control of the mountain regions, the Maquis did dominate quite large and secure fortress zones in which the first steps could be taken in order to create a full range of institutions, from medical centers and schools to small cooperatives, police forces, and courts. This shows the extent of the FLN's reliance on the Algerian peasantry during the revolution, and that rural and mountain peasantry formed the bedrock for the emerging new revolutionary state to replace the colonial regime. Algeria serves as an apt example of the extensive participation of the peasantry in the course of a revolution. However, after the French were losing grips of vast areas of Algeria in 1956, and after their humiliating loss at Dien Bien Phu, which I would like to make a future video on, a new school of thought was emerging within the French army, which was called the Doctrine of Revolutionary Warfare, DGR. The French military, determined to not lose Algeria, studied the tactics and strategies of guerrilla warfare and attempted to develop a counter-strategy. The new strategy was called Opération Pilote and would involve intense intelligence gathering of rural communities and the usage of collaborators. Neil MacMaster describes it as such. Opération Pilote provides an exemplary case of anthropology going to war, and a key aim is to examine the role of ethnology as a political science in understanding the socio-political organization of the peasantry. The people in charge of this operation directed against rural communities and peasants were some of the most heinous in the army. Neil MacMaster describes their philosophy. The officers' self-image was that of modern-day crusaders engaged in the reconquest of society and its liberation from the hands of the ALN fanatics, but also as agents of a moral rearmament that would save the French people from atheistic communism and the spiritual decay of mass consumer society. In some areas, such as Breira, Opération Pilote would, with the help of Algerian collaborating notables, infest a community with propaganda and social services. This strategy would be combined with massive army movements, where Algerian peasants would be rounded up and those who were not murdered in cold blood would be interrogated en masse. The men would be held in holding zones, which were described as cages. We clearly see that the ideological fervor of Algerian peasants was strong, and had its roots in history, and the French considered this a major threat. The French would continually raze countryside towns while selecting a few to be spared, propagandized and given token social services to. Overall, Algerian peasantry and rural communities served a crucial role for the revolution. Moving away from Skocpol's deterministic model, this section will analyze Baker and Edelstein's concept of revolutionary scripts. This model takes into account the self-aware nature of revolutionaries and the fact that revolutionaries learn from and adapt previous revolutions. Previous revolutions often serve as a template and framework of action. These scripts transcend cultural differences and designate allies, opposing figures, and possibilities. Baker and Edelstein challenged Skocpol's deterministic approach and claimed that while structural forces do play a role, the political crises that commence revolution should not be ignored, and that human assembly is still required and crucial to a revolution. Baker and Edelstein consider how revolutions transmit their influence over long periods of time, and how their scripts are adapted and replayed over the centuries. In this sense, some elements of the Algerian Revolution demonstrate the powerful effect of human assembly. When the FLN launched the revolutionary struggle in 1954, the FLN was a brand new organization. In fact, most Algerians never read the November 1 declaration of the newly formed FLN. Natalya then summarizes the situation. The FLN's first and indeed ongoing challenge was to establish itself as the sole representative of Algerian nationalism and make the organization synonymous with the people. The FLN waged a violent political struggle to cement its legitimacy, both against Algerian political rivals and the French state. Essentially, the extensive human assembly achieved by the FLN to succeed in its struggle should not be disregarded. This section will examine to what extent Algerian revolutionaries used scripts to guide them. Two examples will be analyzed: Ireland and France. The Irish Revolution against British rule served as an important framework and learning tool for Algerian revolutionaries. Donald Hassett illustrates how Ireland served as a means of negotiating and reinventing their own relationships, strategic, political, and emotional, with anti-colonial struggle. Hassett claims that while Ireland sometimes would be used as a tactical example, it was most importantly used to give the Algerian revolutionaries some hope. Ireland, much like Algeria, fought for its independence against a metropole situated just across a narrow body of water. As a revolutionary example, it gave Algerian revolutionaries a framework of action and the idea that it was possible to defeat French rule. Hassett shows that Ireland was, from an early stage, a source of inspiration to Algerians. Ahmed al-Madani published in 1923 a 24-page article titled Ireland's Struggle, in which he claims that Ireland should serve as an example to Algerians to violently engage against the French regime. Later, in 1948, one of the young figures of the Movement for the Triumph of Democratic Liberties, or the MTLD, and a future founder of the FLN, drew even deeper parallels to Ireland. He wanted to use Ireland as a template to emulate its successes and avoid its failures. According to Hassett, Ireland was used as a template to guide the Algerian strategy, using both electoral and armed resistance as combined strategy. Hossein Ait Ahmed writes, when discussing terrorist tactics, "The Irish experience in patriotic combat gives us rich lessons in this subject." However, Hassett also outlines how, especially for electoral strategy, the Irish example was too different to be useful as a source of lessons. One can identify a major rift in carrying the Irish script over to Algeria would be how Algerian revolutionaries, such as Larabi Ben Mehidi, denouncement of the pro-treaty forces during the Irish Civil War. The FLN, throughout the course of the revolution, treated moderates with increasing harshness and violence, and had a harsh stance against any form of cooperation with the French government. Malika Rahal writes that the FLN achieved its dominant position over other Algerian political factions through the use of violence against political adversaries in what was in fact an Algero-Algerian war. Natalya Vince also writes how the FLN violently imposed its hegemony over other Algerian factions, using assassinations and intense violence. However, it is important to not fall into French propaganda. While the FLN was violent, the French claimed that the FLN was a totalitarian party, which outright massacred anyone who did not support it. This is a false characterization, but the ALN was plagued with internal purges and fears surrounding potential French agents and traitors. Between 3,000 and 7,000 militants died between 1958 and 1961 for the result of purges. This level of inter-Algerian violence had its parallels in Ireland with a civil conflict between pro-treaty and anti-treaty forces. Overall, it is clear that the Irish Revolution served as a source of inspiration and precedent to Algerian revolutionaries. However, in some aspects, they deviated from it and adapted the Irish script. The French Revolution was responsible to a large degree for creating the modern French state and identity. Given this, Algerian revolutionaries often used this vital historical event, which held great symbolism, to their oppressors. Timothy Scott Johnson outlines how the French Revolution was used as a rhetorical tool to point out the hypocrisy of French rule. In the 1930s, Algerian nationalist leaders such as Messali Hadj compared the indigénat to the monarchical privileges of the Ancien Régime and also analogized the prison in which he was held to the Bastille. In the 1943 Manifesto of the Algerian People, Messali Hadj and Ferhat Abbas also used the French Revolution as a tool to demonstrate the disparity between the lofty ideals of the revolution and the realities of French rule in Algeria. While these analogies are used primarily as a rhetorical tool to point out French hypocrisy, French revolutionary symbols were used by Algerians to legitimize their struggle for independence. By using and analogizing French revolutionary symbols, they implied that violent struggle against the French regime was legitimate. While Johnson characterizes Hossein Ait Ahmed as criticizing many Algerian politicians for constantly using the French Revolution as an analogy, we do see some references to it in his report to the MTLD in 1948. He writes that a revolution like the one in 1789 would be destroyed. However, Hossein Ait Ahmed still considers the French Revolution as an important learning tool, especially when studying how other European countries organized a counter-revolution against France. He writes that this is because revolutionary Algeria won't only have to fight the settlers, but also a coalition of colonial countries with counter-revolutionary ideas. The French Revolution was to Algerians mostly a tool to call out the hypocrisy of French rule. France, parading the ideas of civil equality and the rights of man, was in fact responsible for one of the most repressive and murderous regimes in modern history. We have analyzed the Algerian Revolution using two theoretical frameworks. Firstly, this video analyzed Skocpol's theory, which emphasizes the breakdown of the state, international context, and peasant agrarian participation. Secondly, this paper has analyzed Baker and Edelstein's revolutionary scripts, which has a less deterministic approach and analyzes how self-conscious revolutionaries interpreted their revolutionary precedents and how those revolutionary scripts serve to guide them as a reference and framework for action. Both of these theories have validity in the Algerian case. Using Skocpol, we see that the structural issues that were present in colonial Algeria, firstly, the fundamental contradictions in French rule, the pressure put on by the international context, and the power of the Algerian peasantry. And on the other hand, we see Baker and Edelstein's demonstration about the flexibility and historical awareness of Algerian revolutionaries. They demonstrate how self-aware they were and that they knew that they were undertaking a difficult Herculean task against France. Algerian revolutionaries dug deep into history to find references. This video therefore demonstrates the viability of both of these theories. Revolutions have structural elements to them, but it is also important to analyze how revolutionaries frame their struggle. Thank you for watching.